Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News. Today, Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Brussell. Well, Mae, we covered an awful lot of ground last week, and some questions have come up concerning some of the things we discussed last week. And at the end of last week's program, you touched off something very interesting, handing me a book called Who's Who in the CIA and pointing out that one Eugene McCarthy's name appeared in there, and I thought we could touch on that a little deeper this week. Plus, Howard Hughes' name has been in the news an awful lot here lately, and you have a pretty nice dossier on him.
I've been a Hughes watcher since the summer of '68, or a little before, and I pulled out of my file the material and looked at it last night. I'll show you some of the early articles I brought in, because Howard Hughes has to be related to the political assassinations, and we'll go into that on the second half of the program. Were you surprised to see this book, Who's Who in the CIA?
Yeah, where did the book come from?
Well, the book came from East Germany, and there was an article about it in the newspaper several years ago, and quite a stir was caused, and I wrote to the publishers, and a man in San Jose was supposed to carry it. I wrote all over the country, and then I found one at a bookstore in Washington, in Georgetown. They were grabbing them up like mad to see if everybody who lived in Georgetown was listed in the book.
Find out how many of their neighbors were in the book.
And then the publication was never sold in this country. It was put out, it's people, high agents, not every low-level informer, but the big boys. And I brought it in because we were talking about Eugene McCarthy and political elections, and it's apropos of political assassinations, because I've maintained that the electoral process has not been any different than electing Mr. Thieu in Vietnam, that our government agencies select the candidates for us, and if by a fluke one gets in that they don't want, or that he won't go along with them, like John Kennedy, they kill him, or if they know Robert Kennedy is not going to go along with them, the agency can have him killed as a candidate. So I made a promise to bring the book and mention some of the people in this book who are related to my political assassination. And instead of doing a whole show on that today, because we have so much to cover, I'll just read one name each week. Maybe bring the book in each week.
We'll have a continuing series of Who's Who in the CIA.
Who's Who in the CIA that's related to the political assassinations. So I brought in my minutes of the Warren Commission meeting. The commission members had a stenographer take down some of their meetings. They've been declassified. And at one of the meetings of the Warren Commission, the problem came up of who is going to write the Warren Report. And Mr. Earl Warren, chairman of the Warren Commission, Chief Justice of the United States, said, in quotes, there's an important part of our work is going to be putting it together. We have to write one document. So we have consulted the Defense Department, and they have offered to lend us one of their historians to do the job, and we think it's quite essential to the work of the Commission. Mr. Rankin, the attorney for the commission, the chief attorney, said, Mr. Goldberg is one of the men that the Defense Department has sent over. Goldberg is with the Air Force. The other man is Coakley. He's with the Army. Allen Dulles, chief of the CIA, who is a member of the Warren Commission, said, can they write? This is the Warren Commission. Can Mr. Goldberg write from the Air Force, or Mr. Coakley? And Mr. Rankin, the attorney, made the remark, Mr. Winokur recommended them. Well, the meeting goes on, and I would like to read the minutes of the whole meeting. It's fascinating.
Now, this is an official United States government document.
Yeah, this has been declassified. It was declassified February 21st, 1968, from the Warren Commission files. It was marked top secret, and some of the material in the archives is being...
Now, who recommended these gentlemen?
Mr. Goldberg from the Air Force and Coakley from the Army were recommended by the chief investigator for the Warren Commission. Mr. Rankin is telling Earl Warren, I will send you somebody to write the Warren Report, because Mr. Warren is saying it's important to get a good author to tie this whole thing together, so I consulted the Defense Department, Earl Warren says. So he was in on this. And Mr. Rankin gives the names, and when Allen Dulles says, can they write, Mr. Rankin said, Mr. Winokur recommended them. Now, in my research, I take the names and index the names that come up in these various documents. So I turned to W and write Winokur, and I never read about him before. I never heard about him before. But when the little document, Who's Who in the CIA, came out, I look up some of the names that appear in my archive documents of the Warren Report, and I turn to page 562. Dr. Rudolf August Winokur, born 1904 in Germany, lecturer in history, analyst in the OSS from 1942 to 1945. Now, 1942, Hitler was still going. The war wasn't over. 1942, 1945, an analyst in the OSS. 1945 to 1949, those are the years that we're talking about where Allen Dulles took the chief of German intelligence, Reinhard Gehlen, into our CIA, and the OSS became the CIA. Mr. Winokur became the historian in the War Department. In 1949 to 1965, he became the chief of historical division of the Pentagon. That's Mr. Rudolf August Winokur. I would like to know how long he was in Nazi Germany, whether he came over with Reinhard Gehlen. I haven't been able to find out much more about Winokur, but his office of operation, it says, is Washington, D.C. He wrote the Warren Report. He sent them in and wrote the Warren Report. When I say there's Nazis and Germans running our government, believe me, there is. You see articles in the Sunday paper, various articles referring to the Krauts in Germany, in Washington now, or the Germans, if you list them by name, that are really in power. But Mr. Winokur wrote the Warren Report. Also last week, for those who didn't hear the show, we mentioned, like you said, that Eugene McCarthy is listed in the book of Who's Who in CIA, and that was last Saturday. And then Sunday, when I read my New York Times, which I take daily, there was an article about the Democrats are in debt, and they have to raise money for the next campaign. Well, we know they're in debt, about $8 million. So the idea was proposed by a Thomas F. McCoy, former Central Intelligence Agency man, to raise the money for the next 72 campaign. And in the article, it said that Mr. McCoy was the money raiser for Eugene McCarthy in the 1968 campaign. The CIA, when they say an ex-CIA, there is no such thing. You can just erase the X. There's no way of a man claiming, I am CIA.
That's like being ex-mafia member.
Yeah. There are men who say I'm CIA or FBI, but this man from the Central Intelligence Agency raised the money for Eugene McCarthy. Remember, we said last week that I thought his sole role was to smoke out Robert Kennedy, that Robert already had a deal with Lyndon Johnson, and Eugene McCarthy was in on that deal. And then there was another article in the paper, Joseph Alsop, yesterday, that Eugene McCarthy is the secret weapon that Richard Nixon uses, that by his going into the election and saying that he's going to run, he is the best thing for Richard Nixon. He's going to split the Democratic Party. And it also goes on to say, this was in your Monterey Herald, an article saying, with Eugene McCarthy running, the Democratic Party will suffer. McCarthy is a powerful hater, and Senator Muskie has now replaced the late President Kennedy as McCarthy's most loathed fellow Democrat. So if McCarthy wants to hurt Muskie, he'll coax Ted Kennedy to run, which I think he's sitting in the background waiting to do anyway. I think McCarthy is in on this game, this strategy of moving people around, and his funding does come from the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, last week we talked about those X-rays that were in the newspaper, the article about the X-rays on John Kennedy.
Urologist whose expert testimony proved that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin?
That's right. There were a lot of people who asked me during the week or called or said, well, what do you think about that article about the X-rays? And I got 5 letters from people in Los Angeles, friends, asking me, what do you think about that? And they still couldn't see through the statement of the urologist, that he examined the X-rays and they showed that Oswald shot John Kennedy. But I'm not going to review, we did a whole show last week on that. I'm just going to read part of the New York Times article on that subject, which was not included in the West Coast version, which said that other researchers now will be allowed to go into the archives, and the basis of letting them in will not be whether they agree or disagree with the Warren Commission report, and that one of the men mentioned who will be going into the archives is Dr. John Nichols of the University of Kansas, the pathologist who has written critically of the Warren report. Now, that is one of the big breaks of the researchers, because Mr. Nichols has a lawsuit against the National Archives because he's done experiments on the description of the bullet wounds in John Kennedy and claims that there are chemical particles that are different in each of the wounds, and therefore it had to be 2 guns. And he is going to be allowed to get into the archives. I'm hoping all of this comes down before 72. We're into 72 now, but anything can happen. The field is wide open if you read the newspapers. And we're going to rap about some of that today.
So much of the evidence was changed before it got into the archives, though, like the original autopsy was torn up and rewritten.
Well, there's still enough material locked up. I could read a list of the documents that are in there that have not been available. I don't know if they'll declassify those now or whether those hold tight for 75 years, but if there's any discrepancy in those bullets or in the chemical nature of the fragments of the coat that he can find and put them to certain tests, scientific tests. If there's any discrepancies, I think the case could be blown open.
And you think Dr. Nichols is the man to find out?
I have confidence in him. If somebody said, well, who do you trust? Dr. Nichols is a person that I recognize as a researcher. The New York Times also quoted Harold Weisberg, who's written 4 books on the John Kennedy assassination, who is a valuable researcher and a very thorough, exact person. And the New York Times said Harold Weisberg, author of a series of critical works of the Warren Report, termed Dr. Latimer an apologist for the Warren Commission and asked, what does a urologist know about bullet holes in human bodies? So our program last week was all about that.
Yes, in case you missed that program last week, the gist of it was that Mae took the newspaper article about Dr. Latimer, paragraph by paragraph, and pointed out discrepancies. And I think we're being kind when we say discrepancies. But Dr. Latimer is the urologist who was permitted to examine some of the evidence, the photographs and x-rays and what have you in the archives. And somehow, by looking at the x-rays and the photographs, he was able to identify the assassin.
By looking at the x-rays?
Yes, and this wasn't really his specialty. He's a urologist, and they didn't say anywhere in there that he examined any urine specimens or anything of that nature.
Well, I'm glad he got in there, because now the real scientists can get in. And maybe,
that was the point I was going to make, but the fact that he was allowed to examine the evidence now opens the archives up to serious researchers.
That's right. Now, there's something in the newspaper which I think you people out there listening should get involved in, and I'm going to make suggestions to you, because we've said before, this is the year of positive action and not just complaining. The government is hearing arguments starting today on whether or not to have the death penalty. And the arguments given against the death penalty are that it is cruel punishment, it's inhuman punishment, and that it's a racist thing, the blacks and the poor, the underprivileged.
That it's selective, yes.
Selective. The death penalty is selective. But I'm sending off a letter to every member of the Senate and a few members of the House of Representatives. That'll be like 200 or 300 letters this week. And this is the way I express myself to these particular members of our Congress. And I wish the people out there would listen carefully and take down certain points that I believe are important on the death penalty that are never brought up. And it's time that they are. And I bring them from the point of view of a conspiratorial cover-up on killing these people very conveniently does away with who's behind the murder. Now, the arguments that I am writing to the congressman about, and we can discuss these, Bob, against the death penalty are these. In the first place, a man could be innocent, and he can be framed. I've studied evidence that was planted and evidence that was framed, and I think that a man could very easily be put to the death sentence with evidence that was planted. And in studying Oswald and things that were put in his home and garage, or the rifle that was ordered in his name that he didn't have, or James Ray, the way he was told to leave the rooming house and he wasn't even there and came back and was part of a thing but didn't actually do it. I studied evidence planted, men framed. I'm beginning to go into the Alger Hiss case, the hotel registration in Albuquerque, the Rosenbergs. And it's very important in a power struggle in the United States where fascism is very anxious to be the system to replace democracy, that people aren't murdered to effect the social change.
Well, there is a historical precedent of men being imprisoned or actually executed and later found to be innocent. So it's not just a question that it's possible. It has happened.
Yeah, or in these political murders, they're never going to find the man who was involved. Louis Tackwood, a member of the L.A. Police Department, an informer for 10 years, surfaced this year and made the charge that there's a man on death row today that's there because he lied. He was paid by the LAPD because they wanted a conviction, and this man is sitting up in San Quentin in death row, and the Evel Younger and Ronald Reagan and nobody is taking a position of who this man is, and they're ignoring Mr. Tackwood because his charges were really so heavy. So this is an example of a man being framed, and I have documents from former FBI men on how they planted evidence. There was a discussion made in Princeton, New Jersey. Ex-FBI agent his name is Matusow, and he admitted fabricating evidence in different trials. And there are members of the FBI who are involved in this, but there are police department men who are paid off and given promotions to plant evidence. The Jack Kershke evidence was tampered with. He's up on death row, or it was commuted to life sentence when they found that his evidence was tampered with in L.A. So a man could be innocent. And if somebody wants a raise in the department or wants to get a position of power, they will get an informer to say that he was guilty. The second objection to the death penalty I have is that men like Jack Ruby are used by a peer group, and they may not know that they're going to be involved in any other murder or killing, and because of their insecurities, they can be used to murder somebody. And Jack Ruby was given the death penalty, but before he could die, he was sending notes out of jail and he was killed. But men, because of their insecurities, like Jack Ruby, being Jewish in an anti-Semitic society, meeting with the worst anti-Semites in town, could be coaxed to make a deal. And Jack Ruby owed the government $40,000 in back taxes that were at the Internal Revenue Office the day of the assassination. There was a woman who has a document affidavit in the Warren Commission hearings that she was a decorator for nightclubs, that Jack Ruby was going to have a fancy new nightclub and come to a lot of money. There's a real estate man who showed Ruby property for a fancy club. Ruby was in debt, but over and again he was making provisions with a Mr. Rossi to be a partner in a new high-class Playboy bunny club thing that he had never had before. He would have a prestige club.
Wasn't there a waitress in his restaurant who had overheard some conversations, and she was picked up on charges of prostitution or something and committed suicide in her cell?
Well, Betty McDonald was a friend of Jack Ruby's. Yeah, she was picked up. She was with Warren Reynolds, a man who was supposed to have seen Tippit running through a lot, and she died right after the assassination. She was in the Dallas Police Department. She was hung, and they said it was suicide, but her connections were very heavy. But my argument against the death penalty is, first, a man can be innocent, and the second, he can be used not knowing how far up a conspiracy goes. And if you kill Jack Ruby, he can't talk. And again, on another show, I want to do the dialogue of Ruby with Earl Warren, where he wanted to tell what happened, and Earl Warren wouldn't let him.
And now that's in the Warren Commission report,
isn't
it?
Yeah. Do you want to read that with me next week?
I think that would be very interesting.
Okay. So if you kill Ruby and gave him the death penalty, and he's begging Earl Warren to tell what happened, then that part of history is sealed off forever. Then another objection I have to the death penalty is that parole is offered people to commit crimes. They're let out of jail, like James Ray was let out of the Missouri Penitentiary. Charles Manson was on parole. The police department, the Special Enforcement Bureau, knew where he was. At Soledad, in our local community, the officials offer men parole if they will kill a man inside the prison. And then if the prisoners get wind of it and have killings inside the prison, they get the death penalty. If we're going to have the death penalty, will we give it to the warden or to the FBI? How do you decide who gets the death penalty? The planner of the murders makes the deals. You see, the man who offers parole to a prisoner and he wants to get out, he isn't subject to the death penalty.
Still, though, all these arguments are valid, but what happens when it comes before the Supreme Court or any court? They deal with it strictly in terms of legality. And the constitutional question that's being argued, as a matter of fact, the only argument that I've heard put forth by those who favor the death penalty, that side of the question, is that the framers of the Constitution obviously did not consider it cruel and inhuman punishment because they approved of the death penalty then, so it's still valid today. In other words, what the opponents are trying to establish is that somewhere over the past 190 years...
That it's been historically acceptable.
That maybe some attitudes have changed over that period, and that maybe we do consider the death penalty to be cruel and inhuman now, even though it wasn't considered so 200 years ago.
Well, the people that want the death penalty say that it's historically valid, it isn't something new, it's been going on, and although they admitted yesterday it is no a deterrent to crime, it still is something.
And that's been one of their favorite things up until now. Well, that deters crime, that prevents crime, and it's been established, I think, with finality to the point where even the proponents of the death penalty accept that it does not deter crime.
No, and then you go into another reason that I'm against the death penalty is that you use it as a threat. When James Ray was brought over from London and he didn't even have a trial, the attorney who represented him didn't go into any of the evidence of a conspiracy, and this is documented. Again, I want to read this on one of the shows. Mr. Foreman said, "If you don't say you're guilty, we'll barbecue you." That was the word he used, "we'll barbecue you." And James Ray was forced to say, "I'm guilty," although he said to the judge there was a conspiracy, and Judge Battle said, "I believe there was a conspiracy." But the threat was, do you want 99 years in jail or be barbecued? Now, if there wasn't the death penalty, you couldn't threaten James Ray with any of these alternatives. So he wouldn't have had to say he was guilty, because the alternative was then that you're either guilty or you're innocent or you're involved with other people.
Well, that's specifically why the Supreme Court struck down the Florida law dealing with capital punishment, was because the way the Florida law was written was if you pleaded nolo contendere, which means no contest, the worst penalty they could give you would be life imprisonment.
Yes.
But if you pleaded innocent and were found guilty, then you could be sentenced to death.
Which was terrible, yes.
But if you pleaded no contest, they could not execute you.
Yeah, well, you see, that kind of thing, it was used over James Ray. And the killings of other persons after Martin Luther King have just multiplied. I'm studying now the systematic killing of the Muslims now that they've splintered the Black Panther Party. And I have a file on that because I sort of ride with the tide. I see what's happening, and I'm charting the death of the Muslims because they're back on this group now, and to spread more chaos before 1972. Now, there's another area of death penalty that I want to know where this fits in, and this is the department of the CIA or FBI known as the Covert Black Department. This is paid killers. If our society has paid killers who are immune if they kill, how do you determine which ones are killing as part of the agency or individuals, men that commit crimes or throw bombs, that pull out a special card of ID? They don't go to jail. They get off. They are paid killers in our society. The CIA, FBI can send them all over the world and in this country. But if they are part of that agency, their names are hidden, the trials are hushed, and nothing happens. Like the Kaplan boy, Joel Kaplan, was tried for murder in Mexico of killing another friend of hers who was supposed to be a co-worker and agent for the government. He was put in a Mexican jail. And then all the jailers went to a movie one night, and the CIA sent airplanes down into the courtyard, took Joel away up to Marin County somewhere, and he's off. There's a complete news blackout. And Bill Turner's going to do a book on it or an article, and I could do a show on how people kill and get away with it and don't have trials and they escape. Now, Oswald was an agent of the FBI and the CIA, but he never lived to tell it. His mother ran right up to Dallas afterwards and said, well, he's an agent of the government. What are you going to do? Well, they knew what they were going to do with him, and they quieted her down. And Sirhan has connections with FBI and the CIA, and Mr. Roselli of the Mafia in Gangland, who was hired to kill Castro. He tried 6 different times, said that he was hired by Robert Mayhew, who was connected with the FBI, and through the CIA they went to Mayhew. So if Roselli is caught, does he get the death penalty, or does Robert Mayhew get the death penalty?
Or does his boss?
Or that's what I wonder. How many killings, unless you stop legalizing killings?
This is one of my big objections to even having a shadow government, such as the CIA, in a democracy. Okay, if they want to run the country, fine. Then let the people elect the head of the CIA.
Well, they have no choice.
And we'll forget about the president and the Congress and all
Well,
that sort of thing. Just let us elect
Yeah.
the CIA.
Well, Mr. Kissinger and Richard Helms should run for presidency.
Mr. Kissinger, now, what is his official position? He's always referred to as presidential advisor.
He's making a lot of decisions. Mr. Kissinger has more power than anyone in the United States, and he works with the Central Intelligence Agency.
But Congress isn't able to make him answer for any of his
no, nothing. He's
advice or any of his actions. What is his official position, or does he have one?
Is he head of National Security Council?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Kissinger is placed there to make most of the decisions, but he's a buffer between Richard Nixon and that hidden government. We'll go into that when we get into Howard Hughes now. And Kissinger is
I'd
the
almost
front
forgotten
man.
about Howard Hughes.
But I'm going to close the death penalty thing with referring to a letter that was in the Monterey Herald. A man named John Limper in Pacific Grove wrote a letter on antisocial germs. And he is talking about the death penalty, and he said, what alternative do you propose? What would you do with a Manson or Frazier or hundreds of other perpetrators of heinous crimes, people who plant bombs not knowing or caring who is injured or killed? And he said he doesn't think that finality of euthanasia in animals, unwanted animals, is bad. He said society is at war with the butchers on death row. Cyanide gas has proven to be an effective antibiotic against foul germs. Let's keep it in our pharmacopoeia and stamp out as many of those virulent antisocial germs as possible. Now,
Well, that's very cleverly written and all that.
Well, what I want to say to John Limper is this. He is talking like in Germany with cyanide gas, and let's get rid of the germs in our society who plant bombs. And I would sit with him, I would call him, and talk to him and show him how many articles I have on the FBI agents in disguise that are planting bombs, blowing up bridges. Louis Tagwood in Los Angeles resigned from the LA Police Department because he was supposed to hire the radicals to plant bombs at the San Diego Convention and then kill those radicals so that you would think the radicals did it and the LA Police Department didn't hire them. This man wants to do away with Manson and Frazier, and I say those men did not kill. They were involved in a much bigger system, and they're the front men, and if you kill them, then you don't ever have a chance of knowing what happened, because Charlie Manson and John Frazier know who they saw or who was related to the crimes for which they are blamed. And if you kill them, you lose a big clue to solving the question of who is doing the murdering in our society. This man is only hurting himself because he's handing over the power to the people who are doing the murders, and he's killing the link of information that we could get if we wanted it.
Well, he's also throwing out the precise kind of emotional argument that proponents of the death penalty, the people who want to keep the death penalty perhaps for sinister reasons, would throw out as a smokescreen to excite your emotions and all this. We've got to stamp out this disease in our society and the whole law and order syndrome, scare the people to death, and then give them the solution. The solution is if you kill who I say to kill.
If you kill Manson because he's a scum of society, you serve society. And yet if I talk with this man and showed him who was behind the Manson thing, and spent hours with him, maybe he would have a kinder heart and really try to see that the problem is bigger than that. Evel Younger came out this week. He personally favors the death penalty in some instances. Well, the instances he would want would be people like Sirhan and Charlie Manson, because Evel Younger became the Attorney General of the state after being district attorney in L.A., where those cases were tried, and he was involved in each of those cases. And he is the defendant in a suit which we've read many times on the air here of hiding information of the conspiracy to kill Robert Kennedy. So would he want Sirhan killed now, and that would be the end of the information coming out from that end? You see, Evel Younger is in no position to screen for the death penalty, and the fact that he wants it makes it dangerous. And another argument put up was that one man who is generally opposed to the death penalty said he believed it should be given if a man kills somebody in prison or does a slaying for hire. That's Chief Justice Donald Wright said if a person kills for hire, he should get the death penalty. Well, that goes into who hired him. You see, again, if James Ray was part of a thing and another man hired him, why don't you look for the man who hired him?
You're listening to Dialogue Assassination with Mae Brussell on KLRB Carmel. Still, though, when you come right down to it, whatever your real reasons for being for or against the death penalty, when it comes before the Supreme Court, all they can rule on is the legality or the constitutionality of the death penalty. And as I say, that boils down to a question of, is it cruel and inhuman punishment? That's what it all hinges on. And what they have to decide is, in terms of how people in the American society feel today, is it cruel and inhuman punishment? And that's what they have to be convinced of before they'll rule against the death penalty, is that in the interim of the past 190 years since the Constitution was framed, that we've had a change of heart as a society, and that now we do consider it cruel and inhuman punishment. If that's the case, and if they are convinced that's the case,
then there won't be the death penalty.
Then they'll rule against the death penalty. If, on the other hand, they feel that more Americans hold the views as expressed in the letter to the editor from the gentleman in Pacific Grove, if they feel that more Americans want to stamp out these diseases by use of cyanide gas or electric chairs or what have you, then the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the death penalty. That's kind of what it boils down to. Is it cruel and inhuman punishment?
Yeah. But the point that I keep wanting to make, and I think letters should be written about, is that in addition to cruel and inhuman punishment, that your innocent people you don't know how they're suffering because the cruelty can't be expressed. If they've been framed, or if they're patsies, or if they've been put up to something with a lot of promises and people have let them down, you may say, well, they deserve it. They took the chance. They were involved in these murders, and anyone involved in a conspiracy, somebody argued that with me this week, was Oswald involved in any way? And I say yes. They said, well, then he should die. Was Ruby involved? Yes, he should die. But by taking those deaths, you don't cure the disease society has. Like Valachi from the Mafia got protection to give information to the government on the links of how the Mafia ties together. If you caught Valachi in a murder and you killed him, you wouldn't know as much about the tanglehold of organized crime in our society as if he lived. It has nothing to do with how cruel it is to kill him or to confine him. Like Hoffa said, it was cruel, inhuman treatment to be in jail. The problem, selfishly, isn't how much cruelty is our political decoy or patsy something. It's how are our lives going to be affected if the people who plan political murders kill their murderers. They will perpetuate murders on us. How cruel and inhuman is it to us to live with more murders and genocide? See, it's going to get worse. Or these blankets, these umbrellas, electronic umbrellas of rays and weapons falling on Vietnam, and the electric computer weapons that are coming out are terrible. Or the article yesterday on the electronic surveillance of whole streets and neighborhoods and photographing inside walls and homes. The cruel and inhuman punishment that's coming down from the murders is the effect society is getting from these people. This is why the men have to live.
Oh, the Agriculture Department announced in a recent press release that they're going to use some of the satellites that are orbiting around Earth to spot marijuana gardens.
Oh, we're going to have a lot of fun around here, and I'm not even thinking about how those men have suffered if they were involved in a crime. The innocent ones, I feel badly about, and it's very seldom that you get to death row without having a finger in the pie. You see, you are involved. But the reason
it is statistically provable that it is a selective process, that more poor people are given the death sentence and put to death than wealthy people who have committed the same crimes.
But the thing
and it is racist also. There are more blacks than whites who have been accused of the same crime, convicted of the same crime. Take two given instances where one man is black, another is white.
The white gets
or
off.
One man is poor, another is wealthy. The white or the wealthy person will not receive the death sentence in most of the cases, whereas the black or the poor person will, or be it in the case of Chicano or any minority.
It was the whole thing. Those arguments, those can be understood by many people, and they're reasonable arguments against the death penalty.
And they're not emotional arguments because you can show statistics where it has happened. It is a fact.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that, say in Nazi Germany, a man like Mr. Gumbrell gets out of Nazi Germany. He was tried for treason 3 times, and he gets out, and he teaches now at Columbia University and writes a book on how Hitler came to power through the effect of 400 murders of political people. Most of the people that opposed the rise of Hitler and the system that became so barbaric were killed. And when you kill them, you can't reconstruct how society got the way it did. And if Abel Younger kills his political patsies, these people, then we can't know 30 or 40 years from now even. Sirhan will talk, or Manson will talk, and save some other person, hopefully, the experience of what society went through when they were used. If you kill all of them, you can't analyze the 60s and 70s. That's my fear, is that by taking their lives, and the people that are related to these crimes want them dead, they can legalize it. You see, you can't kill too many people. They've killed Oswald in front of everybody, and Ruby was killed, and the major people cannot be killed in front of your eyes anymore because too many people would catch on. But if death penalty is legalized, all persons involved in the killing can be killed. Like we talked about the assassination attempt on Chavez, and the name of the men has never been disclosed yet, and everything is very secretive. And these men may go out and kill again. And I have been reading more about people wanting Chavez killed since we did that show several weeks ago. But all they have to do is find a hit man and then a man to kill him. And the FBI will quickly swoop in and get him and put on the death row if death penalty is allowed. And then you won't know who among the federal government wanted Chavez killed.
And we're told that 2 men are in prison in connection with the conspiracy to kill Chavez. Neither of them was arrested on grounds of conspiracy or anything. One of them was arrested for another murder, and I forget what the other was.
And they put some drugs on the other one so he'd be in jail and wouldn't be free to interview. It was a trumped-up charge.
Yeah. But they didn't release the men's names. We don't know what prison they're supposed to be in. We don't really know they're in prison.
And we don't know if...
We don't know a thing about these men. All they've said is, oh yeah, there were a couple of guys that were plotting to kill Chavez, and one of them we arrested on murder, the other we arrested on narcotics conviction. They're both in prison. Who are they? Where are they? Well, we can't tell you.
That's right. And the man who's in jail on the charge of murdering another person, he's a perfect person to let out to kill again. Nobody knows his name, because once you're wanted on one charge, you run fast. You know, run, rabbit, run. You're just going to chase off, and so they're not going to tell you. They may let him off. He hasn't even been brought in on the charges of the one murder, and he's a perfect one to be let out to do a hit again.
Well, I've taken you far away from Howard Hughes, because we started discussing the death penalty, and that's something that I could talk about for the next 3 hours or so, but we did promise to open your files on Howard Hughes.
Well, you know...
Is there a Howard Hughes, Mae?
Is there a Howard Hughes? I started watching Howard Hughes in 1968. I have an article here from July 68, and a little before that I have some other articles. When he moved into Las Vegas at night, in the dark of night, with that train full of people, and moved upstairs to this large apartment, I began to start collecting articles about Howard Hughes' move into Vegas. For this reason, by 1968, I had already been studying the political assassinations for 5 years, the murder of John Kennedy, and I knew through meeting with other researchers and through my own documentation and government documents that there was a conspiracy. And if there was a conspiracy, then the government was drastically overthrown, that another government behind the back of John Kennedy overthrew that government. And you're studying power when you study political assassinations. That is what you're studying. You're not just doing a clue of a homicide on the street corner. You're studying the power of the free world, the oil, the steel, the copper, uranium, gold, diamonds. And I suggest that you see Diamonds Are Forever. It's playing now at the Cinema 70.
That's a James Bond movie,
Have you seen it? Yeah,
Oh,
well, they've got the Howard Hughes apartment upstairs, supposedly, and everybody who's listening should see it. It's a must. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had an article about Mr. Hughes' penthouse, and it said, on quotes, one entire wall contained a console with 40 television monitors on 10 channels. By pushing a button, Howard Hughes could spy on almost every square inch in Las Vegas. Hughes was not a voyeur. not much. He wasn't a snoop. It was his way of participating in life outside his self-imposed prison. Now, and then it goes on to say that he has all Mormon assistants, all wear white, neck to toe, all look alike, walk alike, sound alike, these 5 men that care for him. And we'll jump around a lot on this Hughes thing, but go see the movie, because on television the other night on that Mike Wallace interview with Mr. Dietrich, when they talked about Howard Hughes, he said, does Howard Hughes have a beard like they say he does, or long hair, or is it short? And Mr. Dietrich says he has a long beard, he has short hair, he has wigs, he moves all around. It's more James Bond than you ever would believe. And so I read this from Wall Street Journal, and I tell you to see the movie and to tie in the
because the movie may be closer to fact than fiction. Huh?
Oh, yes. And then I'll read you an article in yesterday's paper to give you a background on the Hughes thing now, and it was from Athens. And a foreign minister from the nationalist China said Sunday that President Nixon's life may be endangered during his coming struggle. He said with the power struggle going on in China today, he could be part of a victim of internal party strife. Nobody knows what happened to Lin Pao, and similar things could occur suddenly to Richard Nixon. Now, analyze the article. The two people that really would be on Richard Nixon's back in terms of power, they're talking about a power struggle. The article comes from Athens, Greece. That's the country that selected our vice president, Spiro Agnew. The Papa's Foundation, the money there, came to Washington and New York and said to Richard Nixon, if you want to run for president, take Agnew as your vice president. And also the country that loses the most by the Nixon trip is China. Now, I've made a lot of bets on other ventures, like in '66 when I made personal bets with friends. I'm not a money grabber, but just $1, $2, or $5 or $10 here and there, that I made bets that Robert Kennedy would run in '68. If anybody out there wants to make a few small bets or bets with me, send me a postcard. That I've said on the show before that I wouldn't give Richard Nixon life insurance on this trip, because if Nixon does not obey with the people that put him into power, and he is not the president, people have put him into power, that he is walking a really fine line. And the overture to China brings in one more alleged cover story for his murder. One would be the anti-Castro Cubans, because he did not go back into Cuba and invade during this period of time. And the other motive would be a Chinese nationalist now as a cover thing. And this article sounded scary to me, because they're saying, see, we told you those Chinese killed. You see, this is the first overture to China of anyone in the administration, and if they linked it with the death of Richard Nixon, it could come down on our East-West relationships, and the I told you so's who run the ammunitions industries in the Southwest and all around the world would be back swinging. There was a memo in the paper yesterday, a secret memo to NATO organizations from Mr. Melvin Laird saying, don't worry about arming Western Europe. We're going to put full forces there. Congress may say they're cutting off funds, but we have it in our control. Don't worry about it. Everything is under control. Europe is still a scene of offensive action. And they're not about, you see, if we can prove, that we made overtures to China and they did our nice president in after all those friendly ventures, it could spell a lot of trouble and an excuse to tighten reins here. Now, what they were saying is that there's a power struggle in China going on. And what I am saying is that if you watch carefully and read your papers and analyze this country, there is a power struggle going on in this country. And that gets back to Howard Hughes moving into Vegas, because Mr. Hughes is Mr. America. He is something bigger and stranger and more weird, and the mystery is unraveling every minute. Every news release that comes out now, we could go on, is unraveling more of the mystery of what's happening there. But the way I analyzed it when he moved into Vegas is that we did have a police state when the president was killed. The government was overthrown, and I had already studied this for 4 years plus 1 month. And there were two powers in this country. Now I'm going to break down the illusions. The new song that's American, what's the song about? Apple pie?
American Pie.
Yeah, bye-bye, American Pie. Yeah, and I'd like to do that song because it's about 20 references, I think, to the assassination. But the dreams of American Pie, there was a power struggle in this country between J. Edgar Hoover, who is lined with the mafia and the FBI and the mafia and the gangland and the hoodlums and the Masons and a very strong group. Hoover is incorporated into what I call the racetrack crowd. People have never associated Hoover with being anything but apple pie, mother, and American flag. And I think Hoover's ties go deep into the whole situation of the mafia and gangland. I think the mafia was involved in the Tippit killing and with Jack Ruby and the Sirhan and the racetracks, and I'm sticking my neck out here. And also I think up with the Oda trial up north. Now, the second power that opposes that branch is our eastern seaboard, the so-called establishment, Allen Dulles, the CIA, George Bundy, Dean Rusk, the intelligence system, what I call the white Christian working with Nazis, the armament industries, the aerospace, the defense intelligence agency. There are two blocks of power, each scratching each other's back in the United States. And in order to gain control, you have to tighten the power of one against the other. Now, what you're getting in centralization of power, and I could go for hours on this, is when the CIA moved to the White House just a few weeks ago, they referred to Richard Helms as the czar. They referred to the Pentagon as taking second place, that this defense establishment was moving in to the White House now. And the Pentagon and military were to take second place. The spy system headquarters, the director, was to move into the White House. And that was the reason for the split of the CIA. Richard Nixon always says he's saving you money. It has nothing to do with that at all. It has centralization of power. The White House, in terms of power, makes all decisions. Congress makes none. I can go down. I have a file called Congress Not Effectual Anymore, and I could just read all the different items to prove that Congress has no power of any kind anymore. The third thing is that the candidates for all the elections are funded now by the CIA. Agnew was funded by the Pappas Foundation and men like... These are things that are in the open that are coming out, but the CIA is the heaviest funder of the intelligence system, of the electoral system. This is why Spiro Agnew is dead set against taking $1 from every citizen to finance the elections, because then the police establishment would lose some of the hold they have. You see, the Democrats are in debt $7 or $8 million, so they can't run a candidate that isn't selected. But when Howard Hughes moved into Vegas, I felt, and watched him, I felt that the reason he moved there was to squeeze the power from the gaming tables, the skimming money, the racetrack crowd. They are an ethnic group he doesn't dig. He doesn't get along with their ways. He's the no smoke, no drink, all white Mormon purist, watching everyone else shack up through his television screen, not being able to make it himself, and no matter how many beauties they say he had, I don't think his relationships last a minute, if there is such a man. You know, he is the official voyeur of the century. But he moved into Vegas for the purpose of squeezing the mafia. Now, I have a brother-in-law that works for Hughes that he said, why is Howard Hughes going into Vegas? And I said, I'll venture an opinion. There were people in the Southwest and elsewhere that said they thought he was going to build these special airports out of L.A. and the Mojave, and that was his purpose. I said, no, it has to do with power. And when the scandal came out last year, when Howard Hughes left Vegas and said, Robert Mayu may not run my gaming tables anymore, I leave it to another party, he put Intertel, International Police Organization, in charge of all of Vegas. And then the story came out that Mayhew was an ex-FBI man. And the link of the FBI, which I had figured out 4 years ago, began to all come into print. And my filing cabinet bulged with articles of which side each person is on. Now, this morning's paper, when I came in, had an article which was really interesting. It's from the San Jose Mercury on Howard Hughes and these various suits that are coming out. And the radio program the other night mentioned that Clark Clifford, Secretary of Defense under Johnson, was getting a loan for Richard Nixon's brother. To show you what a one-party system is, Bob.
A loan from Howard Hughes.
From Howard Hughes. I mean, Johnson's Secretary of Defense, who's an attorney for Hughes Tool Company, is getting a loan for Donald Nixon, and Clark Clifford has denied all of this. But Melvin Belli gets into the news and says a Dayton journal is quoting Belli from San Francisco, who said the loan was the payoff for Nixon's effort to get his St. Louis to New Orleans route. The important thing is that Melvin Belli, Jack Ruby, Vegas, their names are all interlinked into this thing. How Belli knows what the loan was for is interesting to me. Another man who's getting into the act is Roy Cohn. And I have documents about the link of Roy Cohn to this hidden government in Jamaica and the link of him to the mafia and restructuring the aerospace industry. They were all a team at one time. And these people say, who was behind the assassination? And some of the team, I'm going to mention the names because follow your news now. Richard Nixon, Bebe Rebozo, George Smathers of Florida, Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Baker, Defense Industries, organized crime. All of them worked together, and they began in the Strategic Air Command and in the OSS that became the CIA. Now, down in Jamaica, there's a hotel where a man named Hughes is supposed to be living. He was last known to be around in December. Somebody mentioned he was frozen in a box, and the box was thawing. An article's coming out in Ladies' Home Journal that he wants to be frozen. Mayu, I think, representing the Las Vegas group, is pressuring the appearance of Hughes because he may not be there at all, and that would prove that he wants his job back, that he wasn't really fired by Hughes. The struggle is definitely between the gangland and the mafia and a certain element of society against Mr. Hughes and the defense agencies.
Well, was Howard Hughes just an individual upstart who wanted to muscle in on some of the power, or is he a part of one of these structures that you spoke of? Or
well, I think that Howard Hughes has to be similar, say in ilk, to an Adolf Hitler who never surfaces, who moves the screens, who watches the people, who gives the orders, who has the funds, who gets all the contracts for the war, who hires ex-generals and people involved in our defense industry. And he's a man who maybe existed, who has been replaced with voice boxes or people. Go see that movie. The power that he has to be broken. I called Jack Anderson's office in Washington this morning. They won't handle yet the conspiratorial link of all these people. They want documents. It's hard to document everything the CIA does. You couldn't document that Hughes had a television watching every inch of Vegas. Yesterday it came out in the Wall Street Journal. Some of these things you can't document. You can put
and they're so fantastic that it's hard to believe them without some kind of documentation.
That's right. But now I brought you a few of my older articles when Hughes went into Vegas, how he began to infiltrate the underworld and shake up the Cosa Nostra, and the effect of his moving there. And the FBI was against striking on the crime force. And there was one article, this was in October 1971, is Hughes selling out his Las Vegas interests. And it says, would the underworld veterans brought out by Hughes years ago slip in again, or would they return legally as stockholders of the corporation? You see, there he put a lid on the underworld and the skimming money and the activities. But did they get even now by killing him? You see, or smoking him out. You see, this confrontation now of bringing in Donald Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and Clark Clifford, I don't know whether it's done purposely to affect our elections in '72 or whether it's just a natural spilling, because I call it the year of truth or the year of the rat. Is it all going to just come out of its own accord and then be put together like I'm trying to put together, only at higher levels?
It is such a James Bond science fiction kind of tangle there. What I don't understand is, getting back to Richard Nixon's trip to China, would he knowingly walk into such a thing as that, or can we build a scenario, a kind of a science fiction James Bond sort of a script whereby maybe there's a double for Richard Nixon who is actually going to make the trip, and that President Nixon, the reason he seems so confident and all that, even though he's alienated so much of American society and everything, he seems perfectly cool, and he doesn't seem like a man who's running scared or anything like that. He's got the John Birch Society against him. He's got all the minorities against him. He's got, I would say, most of the liberals against him.
Well, John Kennedy...
And he doesn't seem to be upset about it. He doesn't look like a man who expects to lose an election or who is even concerned about an election.
Well, John Kennedy had so many people that hated him after the steel strike and the Bay of Pigs and the nuclear test ban treaty and meeting with Khrushchev and de Gaulle And he walked the streets. He went out in Dallas on a sunny day right into the jungle, and somehow or other he had the confidence, that God was with him, and...
Well, the scenario I was building is that maybe Richard Nixon knows that he doesn't have to worry about the next election, that there's going to be a big show made of an assassination in China, and whether it's a double or something else.
Oh, well,
that maybe he'll wind up in a penthouse in Jamaica somewhere.
Maybe they'll send that actor. His name is Dixon. Maybe, I think we mentioned last week.
Maybe they'll send David Fry.
They've sent he's ordered a second airplane in Air Force One, an exact duplicate of the first one. How do you know which one is going? I don't know what he thinks about the trip to China, but I know that making those overtures to China, going against all the people that put him into power, he has his reasons, or they have their reason to send him to China.
That's what I was thinking. Maybe
they have their reason to send him to China.
And it could be that he's going along with this either as a dupe who doesn't know he's going to be assassinated, like Lee Harvey Oswald, or that the game plan is that he won't be assassinated, but the world will be led to believe he was assassinated, something like that, maybe.
Well, it's a very treacherous...
See what you've got me doing, Mae?
Yeah, it's a treacherous way to live, because let me take it away, though, from the James Bond or the hypothetical to this point. All of the things that I throw out here, like lawyers' names like Belli or Roy Cohn, or people Bibi Rebozo or Richard Nixon, they all have assignments or places. This is what I was arguing with on the telephone in Washington this morning, was the fact, it was Les Whitten, investigator for Jack Anderson. He said, I just don't go along with the conspiratorial thing. He says, I study coincidences, and they just don't add up. And I said, well, take the simple coincidence that in 1945, when Richard Nixon was lieutenant commander of the Navy, and that his job was to wind down active contracts with the aerospace firms in 1945. He receives a call from the vice president of the Bank of America saying, do you want to run for the president of against Voorhees as a member of the Congress at that time. And it wasn't a coincidence that the vice president of the Bank of America wanted Richard Nixon, just a fluke of history, to run. Now, I was saying to Mr. Whitten that at the same time that his campaign was going against Voorhees in California, where they were saying that Voorhees was a communist and a red, which was not true, a group called the Goon Squad in Florida was running a campaign against Claude Pepper, saying he was a communist, and Rebozo and Smathers were running that gang and that campaign like Richard Nixon's was running here. And Richard Nixon supposedly didn't know those men and turned out to be their best friends later. Their campaigns were identical. Neither one was true. They put out two honest public servants with smear. The same people engineered and escalated their power into Congress. And I think these people have names and dates. And while we say it all sounds really spooky and hypothetical, will be Nixon be killed or not, we know that a president was killed shortly before his next election. We do know that a man running for president was killed on the eve of his primary victory. So these things are happening here. When a man from Athens, visiting Athens from nationalist China, said there's a power struggle going on in China, all he has to look at his home scene. We know that our labor leaders are being killed, but our candidates are being killed. When computers and automation comes out with a finding that if McGovern ran, he'd be killed, we can say there's a power struggle in this country. And we don't have to look over to China. Let's clean our own house and look at our own people.
Well, could the scenario go then that if Nixon were assassinated, then Agnew would become president, and let's say that certain elements of our society were so opposed to Agnew that they rose up in overt rebellion, then in the process of putting down that rebellion, or perhaps something would be triggered off by something Agnew would do that would create a state of anarchy in the country.
Well, there's no way.
Then you couldn't have an election with the country in that kind of state in November.
Those studies have been done on stopping the election in 1972. If there was a rebellion, if there was an assassination, and Agnew was president. Yeah,
this is not an original scenario I'm doing here. This has been thought out by the think tanks.
Oh, I have a file. You know, when I say I have a file, I have a 4-drawer filing cabinet with 1,800 different subjects, and one is the possibility of canceling the elections in '72. The articles about that. So anything is wide open now. If we had the chaos of suspicion, if Nixon is killed, there is a chance we'd stop the election. But if you control your candidates, like Muskie or Nixon, you don't have to stop the election. See, so many people were onto that it's just like people were very happy about the concentration camps, the internment camps being done away with. But all you have to do is have money from the Safe Streets Act from the federal government, put new prisons in, like Vacaville, and do lobotomies, and you don't need concentration camps.
Our time is up again, Mae, and we just started, and you didn't really get to even touch on that vast file you have on Howard Hughes there. We had to move along at a mile a minute trying to cover so many subjects and so many little details. Just one quick question before we go. In your opinion, is Howard Hughes alive?
My research facts that I use lead me to have some opinions on different subjects, but on that one I can't say. I know elements that would kill him to prove that he didn't give out the orders to change the gaming tables in Vegas. I have no way of knowing now. I absolutely wouldn't say.
It's a mystery even to Mae Brussell.
Even to Mae Brussell, I would not say. Maybe next week.
All right, we'll look forward to that. And again, thank you, Mae Brussell.
You've been listening to Dialogue. Dialogue is a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.